Hey everybody, this is Jonah Lupton, your host of Startup Sense. Hope you're all doing great today. So, another exciting episode on Startup Sense. Today we are speaking with Robert Sadow from Scoop. Right, Robert?
That's right.
How are you, man?
I'm great. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yeah, I heard about Scoop a while ago and definitely excited to talk to you about that today. What kind of a company you guys started, how you're building it, scaling it. First, just give us a little background on yourself.
Sure. So I grew up in Atlanta. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but my experience commuting growing up was driving 25 miles each way to high school, and so this topic that underpins Scoop has been something that's been near and dear to my heart for a long time. Went to school in Philadelphia at Wharton. Started out my career in New York working at Bain and Company doing strategy consulting, and then left to work on and build Scoop full time in January 2015.
Awesome. Okay, so it's been a little over a year and a half then, I guess. How did you guys get started in this? I mean, what was, you just wake up one morning and say, I want to do something, like carpooling, or how did it come to you?
It really started for us as a passion topic, and I mentioned a little bit of my experience growing up. And my brother is my co-founder, John. He was a product manager at Google, and we had always talked about whether we might do something together. And I lived in New York, as I mentioned, for a long time, from 2008 to about 2013. After school, never really thought about the experience of commuting at all, because no one drives himself, in the city anywhere. Or at least it's the worst option for how to get around. When I moved to the Bay Area in late 2013, my brother had already been out here, but for me, it was like reconnecting with this experience of commuting growing up all over again. And how much time it takes, and the stress and the energy and the impact on the environment all became topics that were really important to us personally. And this idea of how do you build congestion-free communities just became a topic of real importance. And so that led to some tinkering and playing with ideas in 2014, but it all really started just out of that deep personal experience of what it feels like to get back and forth to work driving alone over long distances.
Now, before you guys went out and started building anything, and I'm assuming this company is mostly driven by mobile, did you go out and talk to, potential users, or had you guys had just so much experience with commuting yourselves that you kind of knew who the customer or the user would be?
Now, we probably spent about 6 months just doing research before we built anything. For us, we wanted to make sure we really understood this problem. If you think about carpooling, there are lots of companies or lots of folks that have tried to do something that makes it easier to carpool over time. And we felt like we really need to understand why people drive alone, why they don't carpool, and who's really impacted by that before we could actually build anything that would be effective.
So what was some of the data that you guys did collect? Why do some people commute or carpool and others don't?
Yeah, the most interesting thing was there really were two big topics that we stumbled upon. One was it's just not that easy for most commuters to find folks that are coming from where they're coming from, going where they're going at the times that they want. And it was interesting is you actually could find research papers back from the 1970s and 1960s that talked about how if you could solve that problem, everybody could carpool and the world would be utopia and all these great things would happen. But the bigger issue that we discovered that no one was talking about was most people just don't know what time they want to go home when they get to work in the morning, or it changes during the day, or it changes day to day. And so if you're stuck in a carpool where you have to go home with the same person you came to work with, we have to know what time you want to go home when you get to work. The loss of flexibility was enough that people would decide to drive alone, even if it took them longer, cost them more, was worse for the environment, higher stress than carpooling. And
Right.
so that's one of the first things that we learned and realized that we really had to solve that problem around scheduling and flexibility before we could really move forward.
Right, right. I mean, I lived in Boston for 7 years. I lived in the city, like downtown. So, I actually walked to work every day, which was fantastic. But 90 something percent of my friends lived outside the city, and they either had to drive to work every day or they had to take the train. But even the ones that would rather take the train normally had to drive if they were in sales or any other job where they might need their car during the day to drive out of the city to see a client. So it's like, even if you want to commute sometimes with a train or whatnot, you do need that car. Um, okay, so you guys did some research, talked to some potential users. You obviously saw some demand or need for a product like this in the market. What was next?
Yeah, so for us, if you think about my background and my brother's background, so I spent most of my career doing consulting for large enterprises, and so what I was really curious to understand was, so much of the experience here, or the problem with carpooling, as you mentioned, was around both density, having enough people going back and forth that you could share trips, but also flexibility, which also requires density if you think about it. And so the natural place that we went was, you can think about clustering in two ways, right? You can think about clustering based on where people live and where they work. And where they live is difficult because neighborhoods are all different and different sizes and different associations, things like that. But enterprises are enterprises, and they all probably run into some challenges around commuting. So our next step was to talk to potential employer partners and see how they experience this problem, whether it was as resonant for an enterprise as it was for the actual underlying commuter.
So who were some of the first companies you guys reached out to?
Yeah, so the first one that we worked with was Workday, which is a HR software company based in Pleasanton in the East Bay of the Bay Area.
And what was their feedback for you? Did they, see some value in this concept for their employees?
They did. It was interesting. We spoke to a woman named Sonia Rose, who's still one of it was our first partner and kind of one of our closest partners along the way. And we had a 30-minute call, and the first 29 minutes of it, she was telling us how big of an issue this was for her employee base. And if you're familiar with the geography of the Bay Area, Pleasanton's about 45 minutes east of San Francisco. It's pretty far from the peninsula. Everyone drives there unless you live on very particular routes that have transit. And so she was about to start a carpooling switchboard, if you will, where people could send in requests, and she was going to try and match them together. And we said, we think we can probably do you one better, with a little bit of technology added to it. And it all kind of started from there.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I can see where, even in the suburbs outside of, major metropolitan areas like San Fran, Boston, in large apartment complexes, you could easily have people in that complex that are all going to like the exact same area.
And that was one of the most fascinating things about it, and if you think about whether it's Workday or, we work with a number of large companies like Cisco or office parks like Stanford Research Park, what we kept finding was, if you worked in building A in finance and I work in building F in marketing, we could easily live on the same block or live in the same apartment building, be doing the exact same commute every day and have no idea each other existed because companies aren't organized around point of origin, right? They're organized around function. And so the larger the enterprise, the more we would find this really opportunistic way of thinking about building community based on home origin and making the trips much more efficient as a result.
So you've talked to users, there's a need. You've talked to some companies, you know that they have this problem as well, and in some cases, we're even thinking about trying to build a solution themselves. So now, okay, you've kind of convinced yourselves, we need to do this. At what point do you guys raise money, or do you try to bootstrap it and then try to raise money? What was your thinking?
Yeah, so the first thing we did was we wanted to run a pilot before we raised any capital, and we did it by building basically a prototype that was as simple as possible. And so, from my experience, the right way to pilot anything is always to slim it down to the very basic or core questions that you need to answer. And so for us, the questions that we were trying to answer were, would people actually use this to get back and forth to work? Would people be reliable, or would they get stuck and we would have all these problems with stranded commuters? And would they like the experience enough that they would tell us that they would continue to use it, and this is something that was valuable for their daily lives? And so the way that we really approached the pilot was working with Workday. We enrolled some of their employees that were commuting specifically from Oakland to Pleasanton on a daily basis. And this was, it's about 35 miles, depending on where in Oakland and where in Pleasanton. And ran it for 4 weeks, where they had a very first version of our app. You basically had a little mobile web tool or a first version iOS app. Basically, we acted as the switchboard for matching, where you could put in requests and we would try and match people together, and did it in the simplest way possible just to see if it worked.
Right. And what was what was your experience with that? Did it work?
Yeah, I mean, we found that it worked, and that a lot of the opportunities around it were ones that would solve with scale, right? So we found increasing requests week by week. People kept using it. The feedback was such that, I wish there was more flexibility in times, or I wish I could always get matched. Things that obviously with more people in the system would get better. And most importantly, we asked if they would recommend it to friends and coworkers, and more than half the folks basically said on a 0 to 10 scale, they would recommend it a 10 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10. And so for us, it was enough early feedback that we said, okay, there's an opportunity around this. The need is large enough, and if we can get the experience right, then there might be a real opportunity.
Right. And was your thinking from the beginning that you would charge, the users a small fee for the service, or you'd charge the company, a fee for offering this to their employees, or was it just too early to even think about, how you'd make money?
Yeah, it's interesting. We really didn't think a lot about monetization in terms of exactly what the strategy was going to be, but we knew there were a couple of options. So we knew that either we would, it would charge riders, reimburse drivers, and take a small piece, or we would charge the enterprises, or we would do some combination. And so we kind of knew that there was like a viable economic model there. And so for us, when we did the piloting, we were much less concerned around any exchange of money, because what we didn't want to do is muddy up the idea of, does this core experience work versus will you pay for it? Because what we basically felt like was, if we could get the core experience right and there was value, figuring out how to monetize on that value we could do, and we knew there were different stakeholders that would find that important enough to pay for. But if we couldn't get the core experience right, then nobody was going to pay for anything. And so we really tried to divorce those two topics in the early testing.
Now, be honest, you're probably one of the few companies out there that's cheering for higher gas prices, right?
We don't cheer for higher gas prices as much as we cheer for structural improvements that make a bigger difference between driving alone and carpooling, right? So, gas prices is one of those things, but carpool lanes that connect major corridors, especially as you think about tolls, and when tolls are reduced for carpoolers versus single occupancy vehicles, anything that structurally encourages better behavior when it comes to commuting versus driving alone are things that we're generally supportive of.
So from the data that you guys have gathered so far, I mean, are you able to determine what the average commuter may save per month from carpooling, depending on how often they use it?
Yeah, so we see the average commuter in our population will end up saving about $2,000 over the course of a year by using Scoop versus driving alone.
And what kind of, other than gas, than gas consumption, what other factors go into that? I mean, I'm sure, mileage on a car is a concern for people that are leasing, because you're less likely to go over the mileage allowance. Insurance, there might be insurance credits or whatever if you're staying under a certain mileage. So what are the factors, like how do you get to that 2,000?
Yeah, so there's a few things. And one of the things that most people don't realize is that gas cost is actually a relatively small portion of the overall cost of what it means to drive a mile, so to speak. To your point, right. A lot more of it is depreciation. It's the actual maintenance, which you may not think about day to day, but when all of a sudden you have an issue, it'll cost you $500 or $1,000 or $1,500 all at one time, which are linked to usage and miles driven, and then things like insurance, for example. And so a lot of the way that we think about the value here is we talk about the things that are directly impacted by commuting, which is mostly gas and wear and tear, but also being able to split things like parking costs and tolls if you're on routes where that's applicable to you. Right,
because even though I think say a gallon of gas is $3 and I'm getting 25 miles to the gallon, that's costing me like 12 cents a mile just in gas. But I think when for like tax write-offs purposes, I think you get like 40, 50 or 60 cents.
That's right. So the IRS puts the number at 54 cents a mile in 2016. Okay.
There you go. Okay. Yeah. So that's probably one of the numbers that you can kind of use, I guess, in your data, at least that, if not more. So when did you guys, according to Crunchbase, you guys have raised, about $5 million, give or take. It's never completely accurate, but kind of walk us through when you guys decided to start raising money, how you started the process. Who did you talk to first? Was it angels? Was it VCs? Was it friends and family?
Yeah, so we started really in network, and the idea was, if you work backwards and say, okay, if I think about the pitch I would want to make and what that investor materials or what that deck would look like, what are all the things we want to make sure we can talk about? And if you think about what good seed pitches usually talk about is, okay, a true understanding of the problem, of the size of the market, of why your product is going to work. How do you think about the landscape? How do you think about the economics? And so we really started with that and said, okay, what would we want to be able to say, if we were to do that? And then let's go ahead and do the work that's required to get there. So whether that's the piloting or the market sizing or the research to understand the problem, and really kind of built out a roadmap to say, okay, when do we think we would get there? And so for us, we started working on Scoop in April or May of 2014 when we were still at our old jobs. Really it's kind of like an every night, every weekend project. And then we ended up going out to raise capital in earnest in January of 15. And so all of the legwork kind of to do that, to at least understand the problem in the market, we did ahead of time, and we didn't really need a lot of capital or anything that we couldn't do out of pocket to get there. In terms of the actual investor conversations, we started with our network and just talking to friends who were building companies or angel investors at friends' companies to get early feedback on the concept. What are the questions we should be asking? What do they think about the market or the problem? And use that to really shape the pitch and shape the way we talk about it over time. Also to get introduction so that by the time we did want to raise capital, we felt like we had already met or had an easy way to get introduced to everybody that we might want to talk to.
Right. Okay. So, raising money is not easy. Certainly if you have a great product, a great team, some traction, the conversation is a lot easier. It sounds like you guys had some of that. You had done kind of a pilot program to get some feedback. Was it easy? When you started talking to these investors, were they all very skeptical? Did they get really excited, or what, what did they say?
Yeah, sure. I think with us, which I imagine is probably true of most companies, it's a mix. You get reactions all across the board. If you talk to 20 different investors, you get 20 different points of view. The thing I think is most important for entrepreneurs to understand is 80% of the work in raising capital happens before the meeting, right? It's actually figuring out how to get that meeting, how to make sure your materials are right, that you've thought through the questions, and that you've actually lined up the schedule of meetings in the right way. I think not enough people invest in how do I actually run a fundraising process effectively, and that in many ways, if you have a good idea or kind of a good mousetrap that you're trying to build, can have as much, if not more, of an impact than how that actual conversation goes, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I've heard some founders say that they had the most success raising money in the very very beginning when they would schedule like all of their meetings in 1 week.
That's exactly right.
Is that what you guys did too?
Yeah, we took the same approach. We basically said, look, we're going to run a process around this, and we're going to spend several months getting all of our introductions ready to go, but not actually get introduced. Have all of the introductions go out basically at the same time, so we could schedule our investor meetings over a 1 or 2 week period. That way we could say, okay, this is when we're doing all of our first meetings. This is when all of our follow-ups are going to happen. We're going to make a decision by this date, and then we're going to be done. I think it's always important that you create some level of scarcity or urgency, because you want people to feel like, or investors to feel like they need to make a decision.
Right.
And so if someone knows, okay, this company is fundraising right now, they're talking to us and all of our peers right now, if we want to move on this, we have to move quickly. That really becomes important to actually have a successful fundraise.
Right. Certainly speeds up the clock, because they're the whole FOMO, fear of missing out mentality at that point. So was it just you and your brother John at that point when you guys were raising money?
That's right. It was just the two of us.
Okay. So obviously you wanted the capital to scale, I'm sure marketing, I'm sure to build out a team, maybe some more engineering help. Once you guys successfully raised the money, how did you start deploying it?
Yeah, so the first thing we needed to do was build a product that actually could launch and scale, right? As I mentioned, when we did our pilot, it was a very first version iOS product, and we had a mobile web tool, and we needed to actually build a team that could help us do that. So immediately went aggressively into focusing on hiring, building that initial core team, and what was that initial product going to look like that we felt like we could launch at a few companies or launch within a particular employment area and scale from there.
In the beginning, obviously, so you need some developers and designers, engineers, etc. Were you guys looking to outsource that to another company or bring that all in-house?
So we brought it all in-house. So we had a little bit of contract support at different points along the way, but we felt like if we were going to be a mobile-first company that was really focused on delivering a best-in-class experience, from an iOS and Android perspective, and also just the underlying matching and the way that we think about putting people in trips, then that was something we were going to have to own in-house. And we made sure that when we approached the fundraise, that we said, okay, what do we really think we need to build a team that can scale to actually do this and approach the capital needs and the size of the raise accordingly.
Right. Okay. Makes total sense. I just lost my question. That was a good one too. Oh yeah. So who was your first hire and your first full-time hire, after you and your brother, of course, and then how did you guys find them?
Yeah, so our first hire was a guy named Scott Hulbert. He's still with us at Scoop, and he was our first engineer, our founding engineer, and I think we found him, and John met him originally. It may have been on AngelList, and
cool.
Scott was actually the CTO or the lead engineer at an ed tech startup down in Southern California, had just moved to the Bay Area and was looking into opportunities, and so the timing was perfect. We got to know Scott, and he was the first person that joined us in March 2015.
Great. Yeah, because I'm sure, you can speak to this. Recruiting in the Bay Area is not easy, right?
It's incredibly challenging, right? If you think about it, you're not just up against a whole bunch of other startups, but also large companies with really established programs that can compensate more than you're capable of compensating. And so it's incredibly difficult. And I think that's where you have to look for unfair advantages. And for us, everybody that we've ever hired at Scoop has been incredibly bought into our sense of mission and purpose. What we believe deeply in is that solving this problem is really important, right? That building communities that are free of congestion and not making commuting the worst hour or 2 hours of someone's daily experience is something that's really important, and you can improve people's daily lives accordingly. And so that for us was really important to establish in our ethos from day one. I think it's really helped us build a team that's both really, really talented, but also very aligned on why we're doing what we're doing and what's important to do.
Right. Okay. Have all of your employees used Scoop at one point or another?
Yes.
That's a good idea.
Yes, incredibly important. We actually, one of the funny things about us is that we are based in San Francisco, and a lot of our employees live in San Francisco. But Scoop is really designed, at its core for folks that are driving longer distances, 20 miles, 30 miles, 40 miles each way every day. So we've had to do some work to actually finesse it so people can take trips. But it's so important for the team to actually be able to experience the product on a regular basis and share the feedback that comes with it.
Right. How do you compensate employees? Obviously, once you raise money, it gets easier. You can give them better salaries or, close to market rate, hopefully. But the people that join you in the beginning are certainly taking the biggest risk. So I would assume that, employee number 1 gets a little bit more stock than employee number 10 versus number, 100. How do you guys break it down? Or I've seen a couple startups say, listen, even though we raise money, we can pay you market salary. But if you want to take a lower salary, we'll give you a little bit more stock to make up for it. Like, how do you guys do it?
Yeah, so we approach it in a couple of ways. One is that when you're a very early stage company, and I still consider Scoop to be a pretty early stage company, but when you're super, super early, like we were in early 15, outcomes for startups are binary, right? It's like you're not talking about how big is this going to be. It's like, does this work or does it not work, right? And so if you think about it, that seed round is basically your lifeblood to make it work, to actually get to a stage where you can say, okay, the question is no longer a binary one, but how big could this be or what the opportunity is. And so in that sense, you should be giving a fair amount of equity to your early hires because they are the ones that are actually going to decide with you as to whether or not this is actually going to work and make it so there's an outcome for everybody or there's no outcome for everybody. And so we certainly thought about that. And as you de-risk the business, that moves a little bit. But our early hires are significant owners of the company, and that was really important to us. We also approach each hire knowing that different people are in different places in their lives, and some people are more cash sensitive and some people want more of the upside. And so we've always approached each offer with a range and said, here's a range of equity and a range of salary, and you could be on the low equity side, high cash side, or low cash side, high equity side, or somewhere in between. Let's find what works for you so that you feel comfortable in terms of your, what's coming in, month to month, but also your upside and what that means for you over the time of your career at Scoop.
Right. Yeah. Last year, I interviewed a couple companies in Boston that were doing that, and I'd actually never heard of that before, but it makes total sense, right? I mean, the guy that, the 23-year-old engineer has, different, financial requirements, I guess, than the 35-year-old engineer that has a mortgage and a wife and 3 kids, perhaps. So
yeah, and even the 23-year-old engineer may have a very different sense of how they think about their fiscal conservativeness, so to speak, or how they think about their life versus a different 23-year-old engineer, right? And so the idea is to at least create enough flexibility that someone can find themselves within that range versus saying, here's the offer, take it or leave it. And one of the things that we're very proud of at Scoop is we've never put out an offer or a range on an offer that has not led to someone actually joining Scoop. And I think that approach of doing it has really helped us in that regard.
Now, are there any other carpooling apps around the country that you guys kind of compete with? But maybe they're in different cities and just haven't expanded yet.
Yeah, we see different things pop up, each month. It's a super interesting space in the sense that the funny thing about carpooling is it's such a resonant problem, right? You're driving on the highway, you look to your left, there's one person in the car. You look to your right, there's one person in the car, and so everybody says, "Oh, wait, if I could just figure out how to put 2 people in this car, we could solve all these problems," and so you get a lot of energy around it. But for us, our real focus has always been on 100 million people in the U.S. drive alone to work, and if you think about it from a percentage basis, about 80% of the working population drives alone, about 10% carpool, about 5% take public transit, and the balance do something else like bike or walk or something. And so for us, we never really pay too much attention to what else is happening in the market in terms of competitive landscape, just because our real competitor is the generations ingrained behavior around driving alone. How do you actually break that down? And if you can do that, that's really the biggest unlock, so to speak, in terms of opportunity.
Right. And I mean, for the majority of the people that I know that take public transit in the morning, whether it's the bus or the train, most of them hate it. It's just the easiest option that they currently have, where carpooling maybe in their market isn't available yet. So with that, I mean, you guys are obviously in the Bay Area, San Francisco. At what point do you try to expand to another city or go nationwide?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that obviously our goal is to solve this problem and help commuters in as many areas as possible, right? That's really the mission of the company, and scaling is required to do that. But we really want to do it in a way that we know we can deliver good experiences and that the business really works before you scale too fast. If you think about startups, for every one startup that fails because they didn't scale as fast as a competitor, there are 9 startups that scaled too fast and failed because they were stretched too thin and hadn't really figured out their model. And so we're very sensitive about that internally. We want to keep moving forward and aggressively help other markets, but we also want to do it in a way that we know we're going to do it the right way, and that's really the focus for us.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, definitely don't want to grow too fast, especially with something like this. I mean, where it's a big problem, there's a lot of dimensions to it. I mean, you got to make sure you have it right before you try to scale. Now, on your investor list, I see a nice mix of angels and VCs, even a couple kind of corporate venture arms, Workday, and then also the one that sticks out to me is BMW. So kind of tell me, how do you guys get hooked up with BMW, and, what type of value do they bring to the company?
Sure. So we met BMW actually through another investment that they had made. It was a friend of mine at a company called, what used to be called Xerx, is now Stratum, Sean Baer, and BMW had invested in their company. And, for us, what was really interesting was the way that OEMs and companies like BMW and GM, for example, evolve over time is super fascinating, and especially as you think about the evolution from where we are today towards shared mobility, toward eventually what would be autonomous vehicles. Understanding how they think about that world and the evolution of this space was really important to us. The other thing that was really important to us or interesting to us is that many people don't know this, but BMW actually has a huge leasing business in Europe called Alphabet. It's actually why when Google rebranded, they couldn't get alphabet.com as a domain. And Alphabet leases to, I think, something like, 50, 60,000 different corporate partners across Europe, and they lease vehicles. And one of the conversations they kept having with their corporate partners was, well, can we add more services on top of the lease, things like carpooling? And so for us, it was interesting for a couple of reasons: that OEM perspective, their sense of how mobility is evolving, but also longer term, whether there are opportunities to work together, given that we both have a little bit more of an enterprise focus in terms of how we go to market.
Interesting. Okay. I mean, because certainly BMW's in the car business, they want to sell more cars. And in some ways, you guys are trying to take cars off the road. but there's a lot more to it than just that.
That's right. And I think most of the OEMs, I think at this point recognize that even in an autonomous world, being able to put multiple people in the car is going to be of paramount importance, right? Especially if you have cars running around with nobody in the car, then the only way that cities or metro areas or kind of the whole world isn't gridlocked all the time, right, is if you get a bit more efficient in kind of the usage of those vehicles. And so I think it's a model that's of interest to a number of OEMs, and what we're doing, I think, kind of sits right squarely in that evolution.
So autonomous vehicles obviously is like, one of the hot topics out there, probably along with VR and a couple other ones. But you have Uber, you have Google, you have Apple, you have a bunch of these companies trying to come out with, self-driving cars essentially. How will that affect Scoop in the future, and kind of where do you see the auto business maybe 5-10 years from now? Are any of us going to be driving ourselves to work anymore?
It's a funny question. We talk about this a lot all the time. My guess is that the first wave of it that you're going to see is actually going to be within dense cities, right? So I think a lot of the OEMs have come out and said that their first autonomous vehicles, and the estimates generally come out in the 5 to 10-year range, are probably going to go to fleets like Uber or Lyft, right, to actually service in dense areas. I think the suburban commute, so if you live further away, the selling of autonomous vehicle to private buyers and the evolution of that will probably be a bit slower. It'll be interesting to see exactly how it develops. My guess is that within San Francisco or within Manhattan, for example, will be earlier in that evolution. In terms of how it impacts Scoop, I think it just makes what we do so much more important, right? The idea of putting people in cars together is a fundamentally human question in many ways, right? Like, you're taking two people, you're changing their schedules. What does it mean to actually put them together, to enjoy that experience? How do they want to exert preferences over that? It's so important, and it just becomes more important in a more shared capacity as you move toward autonomous vehicles. And so for us, we really just focus on how do we get as good as possible at delivering great carpooling experiences so coworkers and neighbors can share trips? And then as we move toward a world where sharing trips just becomes more and more important with each passing year, I think Scoop will be well positioned given kind of the expertise and what we're building from a community perspective around that.
Now, when Airbnb first launched, a lot of people thought it was crazy because, why would I want to rent out my room or my couch to a stranger? And now Airbnb's worth $25 billion. So apparently a few people thought it would be all right. Scoop, I mean, you guys are carpooling and it's potentially strangers sharing a car. How do you make it get people comfortable with each other or trust each other to actually want to get in the car with a stranger and drive 45 minutes to and from work every day? I mean, certainly, after a while they become friends, or they say this doesn't work and they go find someone else. But in the beginning, that's got to be a little strange for them, right?
Yeah, sure. I think Airbnb is a great example to bring up. We have tremendous respect for what they've built, and fundamentally there are many pieces that are similar. The idea back in the day that I would rent my apartment out to someone I've never met before, or I would go stay in a stranger's home, right, is a pretty strange idea. And the way I think they tackled it was around building community and what the experience is like around that. How do you make it more comfortable for a first-time host to actually share their place, or for a first-time renter to feel comfortable with what they're doing? And we invest a lot very similarly around, okay, how do we make that in-car experience really special and expose more information about the people you're carpooling with, so you feel comfortable with who they are, and allowing you to exert some control over who you go with and what that experience should be like and what routes or trips you like or don't like. And so we put a tremendous amount of time and energy internally into thinking about this, so that we can really build a community that feels very strongly about why not only this behavior works for them, but why it's important more broadly for society. And I think that's really helped us along the way.
I mean, have you seen, would you say the majority of your users are, kind of more green people, more environmental friendly, and that's one of the main reasons they get into this in the first place? Or is it to save money, or a combination of the two?
Yeah, it's interesting. We find that generally what attracts people to Scoop at the very beginning is something that's easy for them to quantify, whether it be cost savings or time savings, something of that nature. What ends up happening, though, over time is what keeps people using Scoop is the experience of it, the feeling less stressed because they're actually in the car with somebody else, enjoying the people they meet, feeling like they're building more of a network within their employer or within their neighborhood. Those are the things we quite often hear from people who have taken 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 trips with Scoop. So it's a different set of things that bring you in versus necessarily what keeps you using it. From an environmental standpoint, especially in the Bay Area, I think that's a big deal. But to be honest, we find it to be a small set of people that are primarily motivated by it, but the people that are motivated by it are extremely passionate about that topic. And so if that's really what does it for you, then you're usually one of the people that will sing from the rooftops about why changing behavior or carpooling versus driving alone is important.
Right. Makes sense. What's been your user acquisition strategy over the last year? Are you guys, kind of doing direct marketing to users, or is it mostly from referrals, word of mouth, and then going to some of your big enterprise clients and having them, or the apartment complexes, and then have them kind of pushing it down to their employees or their residents?
It's much more the latter than the former. So a lot of partnership with enterprises and with office parks and cities to bring this to employees or commuters in the area. It's really been an interesting evolution where we started with single companies, continue to still do that, of course, but expanded to areas like Stanford Research Park in Palo Alto, which is a partner, which expanded to areas like San Mateo and Foster City, which are two cities on the peninsula that actually incentivize Scoop trips for anybody that is commuting into or out of those areas. And so for us, those partnerships have really been key for how we think about growth and user acquisition, and then also a lot of referral volume of employees or neighbors, coworkers sharing trips in Scoop and then referring other colleagues, other people in their neighborhood to be able to take trips.
Cool. So since you started this company 2 years ago, what's been the biggest surprise so far that just you just weren't expecting? I mean, it could be good, could be bad.
Sure. I think the biggest surprise to me is just how steep the learning curve is. I'm a first-time entrepreneur. My brother is as well, and it never slows down. And it's one of the things that makes it so challenging, but also makes it so exciting. It is an incredibly tiring. You invest a ton of energy. It's not just your time, but it's also kind of like your emotional energy and what it means to build. And every time you solve a problem, you spring 3 new problems. It doesn't mean that things are going the wrong direction. In fact, that's a good thing because the size or scale or complexity of the problem starts to change. But that's kind of the thing that I probably had the least visibility into going into starting Scoop, was just how steep that curve is and kind of how emotionally and time-wise investing it is to actually build something that you care so deeply about.
It's brutal. It's like a 24/7 job for sure. What's the single best piece of advice you've gotten from one of your investors?
Yeah, I think that is a great question. I think probably the best piece of advice we've gotten from investors is around focus. And it almost ties back to some of the questions you were asking around market expansion, which is if you really rigorously focus on the problem, how do you solve that problem, understand everything about it, deliver a really great experience that the core of your business is healthy, it's much easier to expand and to grow from that point. Versus if you're too scattered or you're too attracted to different partnership opportunities or other things that kind of might be outside of your core focus, it distracts the whole team. It makes you feel unfocused, and it ends up burning capital. And so I think our investors, especially when they focus and say, okay, let's really make sure that we're continuing to focus at what's most important here, and only start to scale or kind of add complexity as needed, that's actually been incredibly valuable advice.
Yeah, it is. It's hard. It is hard for entrepreneurs to focus, especially when you're running the company and there's probably a million things on your plate every day. What keeps you up at night? What challenges do you see in the future that you're trying to tackle now, or anything down the road that could really burn what you guys are building? So you got to make sure that obviously focus is one of them, but what other challenges, or I guess there's a million ways. I just say what keeps you up at night, because that's kind of the best way to describe it.
Sure. It's all of our focus. It's almost all internal versus external. The things that happen externally, for the most part, quite often you can't control. But the internal stuff is really where I spend the most time. How do I make sure that our team is motivated and excited to come to work every single day, how to make sure that we're efficient and that our culture actually and values maintain as we scale as a company. How do we make sure that we keep executing and delivering, improvements to product, improvements to marketing, improvements to our partners on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. That's the stuff I spend the most energy thinking about, and it's a constantly evolving question, but it's one that, for me, probably takes up the most of my mind share on a day-to-day basis.
Awesome. I know you got to get going in a few minutes, so I want to be conscious of that. Any advice you'd like to share with the audience about your journey as an entrepreneur, being a first-time entrepreneur, what you've learned in the past couple of years that could possibly help them in their venture?
I think the one piece of advice I would give is that this is hard. Starting companies it can be glamorous and it gets written up in the press when you raise capital and you hit milestones, but the day-to-day of building a company is exhausting, and it's a labor of love, but it is certainly a labor. And so, the best thing that I've found is that, what gets you through, the high highs and the low lows of it is real belief and passion underlying the problem that you're solving, right? And that the belief that doing that and the mission of your company really matters and that you're working with great people to do that. And so, I'd always encourage entrepreneurs, make sure you're not starting a company for starting a company's sake, and that you find something that you really want to spend that amount of time and energy on because you care about it that deeply. Otherwise, it gets really hard to navigate through some of the more challenging periods, but that passion can really keep you moving.
So what motivates you? What keeps you on this grind?
Just the belief that I truly believe we can solve this problem and change quality of life for commuters and residents at a massive scale. And the fact that every time that we grow or we see more commuters or we get feedback around how this has changed someone's life, or they get to spend more time with their family, or they're happy day in, day out, or they feel more connected to their company, that stuff is the kind of feedback and the kind of input that fuels us. And we think the more that we can improve quality of life for cities and communities around that, then that's a mark that I think we would really be excited to leave on the world.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Let's close it there. I think we ended on a super positive note. I want to thank you for being a guest. I loved everything you had to say. Great advice across the board. It's going to be fun to kind of watch Scoop over the next few years and see how fast you guys can grow and hopefully expand to other cities around the country and, bring those services and help increase the quality of life for other people.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to spend the time and really enjoyed the conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, man, Robin. I appreciate it. And, continued success to Scoop and your team.
All right. Thanks. I appreciate it.
You got it, man. Have a good one. Take care.
All right. Take care. Bye.